A cartel boss laughed as he pulled a blade on a judge in open court. Seconds later, his laughter was drowned out in a spray of red, and what happened next will leave you speechless. He raised his blade in the middle of the courtroom, laughing as the chamber froze in horror. Subscribe if you believe no criminal stands above justice. The gavel struck once, echoing like a thunderclap through the crowded courtroom. The sound silenced the murmurs of reporters and the restless shuffling of citizens who had packed the chamber to witness what many believed was history in the making. Judge Roland Merrick, his robes pressed and his face a carved mask of authority, leaned forward on the bench. His gray eyes scanned the room, landing on the man seated with unnatural calm at the defendant's table. Hector Varela, the feared cartel boss whose name had become a shadow over Valor City, did not so much as flinch. His presence radiated arrogance. The man wore a tailored black suit that hugged his broad shoulders, a silver ring gleaming on his finger as he tapped the wooden surface in a steady rhythm. It was not the nervous drumming of a guilty man, but the calculated gesture of someone who treated this trial like a stage play in which he was the star. Merrick adjusted his spectacles, his voice cutting through the heavy silence. The charges against you, Hector Varela, are severe and numerous. Trafficking, murder, extortion, crimes that have left scars on this city. Do not mistake this courtroom for one of your street corners. Here, the law stands taller than any blade or gun. His tone carried conviction, but beneath it lurked the subtle weight of tension that no one dared to name. The security in the room was tight, officers flanked every wall, their hands close to holsters, yet the atmosphere carried an unspoken dread. Everyone present knew Hector's influence reached beyond chains and walls. Hector smirked, his lips curling as if the judge's words were little more than an amusing script he had heard before. He leaned back in his chair, ignoring the nervous whispers of his lawyers who leaned close, murmuring advice. His dark eyes wandered over the rows of spectators, lingering on the trembling hands of a young journalist clutching his notepad, on the stiff posture of federal officers watching him with a mixture of hatred and fear. Then, almost lazily, he let his gaze drift back to Merrick, tilting his head in silent mockery. The audience shifted uneasily, sensing the strange theater unfolding. The sound of a camera clicking from the press box seemed unnaturally loud, puncturing the air like a warning shot. A man coughed in the back row, and it echoed longer than it should have. The tension was suffocating, pressing against the chest of every man in the room. For some, it was fear of Hector's reach. For others, it was the dread of what might happen if he decided to prove the court powerless. Merrick, however, stood firm. He had spent decades on the bench, staring into the faces of men who thought themselves above the law. Yet, as he looked at Hector Varela, he felt something different, a defiance so deep it mocked the very foundation of justice. Still, Merrick refused to allow hesitation to creep into his voice. He straightened his spine, lifted his chin, and spoke louder. You may believe your shadow stretches far, but in this chamber it finds no ground. The law does not tremble before you, nor will it bend. His words were met with silence, broken only by the steady tap of Hector's silver ring against the wood. The lawyers beside Hector whispered frantically again, one tugging at his sleeve as though reminding him to at least appear respectful. Hector ignored them, his smirk widening, his silence louder than any outburst. He lifted a hand and brushed invisible dust from his lapel, a gesture so casual that it rattled the already fragile calm of the room. One of the officers by the door shifted his stance, fingers tightening on his holster. The judge noticed but gave no acknowledgement, determined to maintain the fragile illusion of control. Yet beneath the solemn ritual of justice, every man in the chamber felt the truth, that Hector's confidence did not come from innocence or clever lawyers. It came from something darker, an unshakable faith in the unseen reach of his cartel. Reporters scribbled notes, their pens scratching quickly, eager to capture every gesture, every line. Federal officers exchanged glances, their jaws tight. The citizens in the gallery leaned forward, some clutching the edges of the benches as though bracing for impact. The air itself seemed charged, waiting for the spark that everyone dreaded but expected. Judge Merrick leaned forward, his lined face illuminated by the pale glow of the overhead lamps. His voice rose, strong and unshaken, even as the shadow of danger thickened. This court will not be intimidated. The words rang out like iron striking stone, firm and final. And though no one could yet know it, the irony of those words would soon tear the courtroom apart. The laughter erupted like a crack of thunder, sudden and jarring in the solemn air of the courtroom. Judge Roland Merrick's gavel hovered inches above the desk, ready to bring down the weight of justice, when Hector Varela leaned forward and let out a booming, mocking sound that froze every man and woman in the chamber. The noise cut through the stillness with cruel precision, rolling across the benches and ricocheting off the marble walls. It was not the nervous laughter of a man trapped by law, but the confident roar of a predator who still held the leash of power. Reporters lifted their pens from their notepads, officers stiffened, and even the most seasoned lawyers felt their throats tighten. Hector's lips curled into a smirk as his laughter swelled, each note heavy with contempt. His dark eyes gleamed with a mixture of madness and certainty. Judge Merrick straightened in his chair, his stern features tightening but not breaking. "Silence in the court," he commanded, his voice sharp, yet the echo of laughter drowned it out. For a heartbeat, the judge looked into Hector's eyes, perhaps realizing too late that the beast before him was not finished playing his game. Then it happened. With a motion so swift it seemed impossible for human reflex, Hector's hand slid from beneath his tailored cuff. A glint of steel caught the light, flashing for an instant like a cruel star. Gasps filled the room before the blade even struck. "No!" one officer shouted, but the warning was cut short by the sickening sound of steel meeting flesh. Hector lunged across the bench like a predator pouncing on prey. His arm slashed with brutal precision, the blade slicing across Judge Merrick's throat in one unbroken arc. A fountain of crimson erupted, spraying the polished wood and staining the judge's white collar in a matter of seconds. The gavel slipped from Merrick's hand, tumbling to the ground with a hollow clatter that rang out like a final verdict. The judge's eyes widened in shock, his mouth opening as if to speak, but only a gurgle escaped as blood pooled across the bench. Chaos exploded instantly. Reporters dropped their papers, scrambling to the floor as officers lunged forward. Shouts overlapped. "Secure him! Get the blade! Protect the exits!" The gallery erupted with screams, men rushing for cover, others frozen in horror at the sight of justice being butchered before their eyes. The air filled with the sharp scent of iron, the coppery sting of blood overwhelming the polished oak and marble grandeur of the chamber. Hector did not run. Instead, he stood over the dying judge, his blade dripping red, his grin widening as though the courtroom were his stage and the massacre his performance. He lifted the weapon high, letting the light catch on its edge, the crimson droplets scattering into the air like twisted confetti. His laughter roared again, grotesque and triumphant, drowning out the cries of the officers who scrambled toward him. "Stay back," an officer shouted, his pistol drawn, but his hands shook as Hector turned his gaze upon him. The cartel boss's eyes burned with defiance, daring any man to move closer. The officer hesitated, caught between his oath and the paralyzing fear that Hector seemed to command without effort. Merrick's body slumped forward, lifeless, his robe soaked through as his final breath rattled in his throat. Elias Merrick, seated near the front as a quiet observer, gasped and tried to rise, but a guard shoved him down, protecting him from the chaos. Elias's face was pale, his father's blood already splattered across his sleeve. His heart hammered, the world narrowing to the image of Hector standing above the bench where his father had dispensed justice for decades, now turned into a butcher's block. Hector's laughter rolled on, filling every corner of the chamber like a cruel echo that refused to die. The sound carried with it a message that everyone in the room understood, though no one dared to speak it. Law was powerless before the will of violence. The marble pillars, the heavy books of precedent, the oaths and rules, all seemed fragile compared to the single man standing there with blood dripping from his blade. For the first time in decades, the courtroom felt less like a house of justice and more like a tomb. The silence that followed Hector's laughter was worse than the sound itself. It was not relief. It was disbelief, a hollow emptiness that settled over the crowd. People stared wide-eyed, their minds struggling to accept that what they had witnessed was not a nightmare, but a reality that shattered their trust in the system. Officers finally surged forward, surrounding Hector, but even then his laughter did not falter. He taunted them with every step, his voice booming. "You cannot cage me," he sneered, his words spilling like venom into the silence. The men circled closer, but no one dared to be the first to strike. The fear in their eyes betrayed the truth. They were fighting not only a man but the shadow of his entire cartel. And then, with a final sneer, Hector let his words cut through the chamber like another blade. His voice dripped with triumph, echoing over the dying gurgles of Judge Merrick, over the cries of terrified spectators, over the impotent shouts of officers who had arrived too late. "This court belongs to me," Hector sneered. The killing shattered the illusion of order. The sharp gasp of the courtroom was drowned almost instantly by the metallic crack of gunfire. Officers surged forward, their boots thudding against the polished floor, but Hector's men had already sprung into action. They had been waiting for this moment, scattered among the benches like wolves disguised as sheep. Weapons flashed from beneath coats and sleeves, pistols snapping into their hands with terrifying familiarity. The sound was deafening. Marble walls trembled as bullets ricocheted, windows burst in showers of glass, and wooden benches splintered apart under the assault. Spectators screamed and ducked, bodies folding into themselves as they slid beneath benches in a desperate attempt to vanish. Others stumbled over one another in blind panic, crawling toward the exits, their faces pale with disbelief that Justice's house had become a battlefield. Smoke from discharged weapons drifted like a suffocating fog, mingling with the acrid scent of blood that already stained the air. Amid the chaos, one figure stood apart, not with power, but with raw grief. Elias Merrick knelt on the marble steps where his father had collapsed, his hands pressed desperately against the gaping wound at the judge's throat. His shirt was soaked, the crimson spreading fast across the fabric, clinging to his chest like a brand. His lips trembled as he whispered, "Father, hold on, please." Though the gurgling silence told him the truth he refused to face. Judge Roland Merrick's eyes, once sharp with authority, had already dimmed. A guard grabbed Elias's arm, shouting above the gunfire, "You have to move, sir!" "Now!" The words cut like an order, but Elias resisted, clutching his father tighter. The guard pulled harder, urgency flashing in his eyes, and finally Elias stumbled back, his hands still dripping with blood. His father's body slipped from his arms, slumping lifelessly against the steps, the gavel lying shattered beside him. Rage like molten iron surged through Elias's veins. His chest heaved, his jaw clenched until it ached, and tears blurred his vision. Yet beneath the grief, a singular flame of fury burned. He fixed his gaze on Hector, who stood amidst the storm as if untouched by the bullets. The cartel boss's blade gleamed red, his dark suit immaculate except for the flecks of blood he wore like trophies. He grinned, a cold, mocking expression, and lifted his chin as though daring the world to stop him. Hector's men fired in controlled bursts, carving a path through the panicked crowd. Two officers lunged at him, but with brutal efficiency his bodyguards cut them down. Their blood pooled on the white floor, a grotesque mirror of the justice that had been promised in this chamber. Hector's voice rose above the chaos, rich with cruel amusement. "This is the law of Varela," he shouted, laughter trailing his words like a knife drawn slow. Elias's breath caught. His hands, still wet with his father's blood, trembled violently. The image of Hector laughing above the lifeless body of the judge seared into his mind like a scar. Every fiber of him screamed to act, to leap forward, to end that laughter with his bare hands. But another officer restrained him, forcing him back behind the shattered bench. "Stay down. Don't give him another target," the officer barked, fear and frustration twisting his voice. Through the blur of smoke and bodies, Elias locked eyes with Hector. For the briefest second, time froze. The cartel boss tilted his head, recognition flickering across his face as if he enjoyed the torment of his victim's son. Then, with deliberate cruelty, Hector raised his bloodied blade high in salute before turning toward the exit. Gunfire intensified as he and his men pressed forward. The heavy doors of the courthouse groaned under the impact as Hector's forces forced them open. Officers attempted to form a barricade, but they fell one by one, their shouts cut short by sharp cracks of gunfire. Two men collapsed in a heap, their uniforms darkening with spreading stains. The sound of their last breaths was lost in the storm. Elias could do nothing but watch as Hector, still laughing, disappeared into the night. The sight tore at him like claws, leaving him shaking, his breath shallow and ragged. Around him, survivors wept, officers shouted commands, and the once proud courtroom stood desecrated, its pillars marred by bullet holes, its sanctity drowned in blood. He pressed his palms against the floor, smearing crimson across the marble as he forced himself upright. His chest heaved with the weight of loss, his mind a battlefield of grief and rage. The world blurred, but his father's voice seemed to echo faintly in his ears, firm, resolute, unyielding. No man is above the law. Elias's lips tightened, his teeth grinding as he whispered to himself, a promise more than a prayer. This isn't over. Not for him, not for any of them. The headlines broke like an explosion. Every newspaper, every channel, every voice in Valor City carried the same shocking words. A cartel boss had slit a judge's throat in open court. The images of blood on polished marble and the silent fall of a gavel played again and again, searing into the collective mind of the city. Crowds gathered in squares, whispering in disbelief, while families locked their doors in fear. On every corner, conversations carried the same question. How had Hector Varela done it? How had security been so blind, so weak, that he could turn a courtroom into a slaughterhouse? Rumors spread like wildfire, each one darker than the last. Some swore the police had turned a blind eye. Others whispered that the cartel had bought men in uniform long before the trial ever began. Fear mixed with outrage, leaving the city trembling between anger and despair. Elias Merrick sat in his father's study that night, the room heavy with silence. The shelves of law books stared down at him like mute witnesses, their spines worn by his father's hands. Elias's own hands trembled as he turned over a news clipping, his father's name printed in bold beneath the words, "Slain in Court." The paper blurred as tears welled, but his expression was not that of grief alone. His jaw was locked, his shoulders rigid, his body holding a fury he could barely contain. He replayed the scene in his mind, Hector's mocking laughter, the spray of red, the collapse of order. Each memory sharpened his resolve until grief hardened into something else entirely. That same night, he was not alone. A man entered the room quietly, his coat carrying the scent of rain and his eyes shadowed by years of battle against men like Hector. Agent Dorian Creed, a federal operative who had pursued the cartel for over a decade, studied Elias with a mix of concern and recognition. He had seen that look before, the burning eyes of someone who wanted vengeance more than life itself. "You shouldn't be here, Elias," Dorian said, his voice low but steady. He placed a file on the desk, thick with names, places, and coded messages. "This fight is not for you. It will consume you before you even begin." Elias looked up sharply, his face pale under the lamp's glow. "He killed my father in front of the law itself. If I do nothing, that laughter wins. I won't allow that." His words trembled, but his hands clenched into fists, grounding his conviction. Dorian leaned forward, his expression hardening. "I know what you're feeling. I've seen men swear revenge before, and most of them are buried before they see it through. Revenge blinds you. It makes you reckless. And recklessness is exactly what Hector feeds on." Elias met his gaze without flinching. "Then I'll sharpen it into something else. I don't want reckless vengeance. I want justice. Real justice, the kind that strips him of his power and makes the city believe in the law again." His voice grew firmer as he spoke, the words shaping not just his resolve, but his identity. Dorian studied him for a long moment. Outside, the city was alive with murmurs, sirens echoing in the distance, the streets restless with fear. Finally, Dorian sighed, his shoulders heavy. "If you are serious, then you'll have to learn to think like him." Hector's arrogance is his weakness. He believes himself untouchable. That pride will force him to act again, and when he does, we'll be ready. But understand this, Elias. If you lose yourself in this, you're no better than the man you hunt. The words weighed on Elias, but he did not back down. He looked at the portrait of his father hanging on the wall, the stern face of Judge Roland Merrick staring back with quiet authority. "I'll do whatever it takes," Elias whispered, more to the portrait than to Dorian. "This isn't only about me. It's about proving that the law can't be silenced. Not by fear, not by a blade, not by his laughter." The room seemed to thicken with silence. Dorian placed a firm hand on Elias's shoulder, the gesture both a warning and a bond. "Then understand the road you're choosing. It's long, and it's dangerous. If you falter, if you let your anger lead, Hector will destroy you the way he destroyed your father. Do you accept that?" Elias nodded once, his face set in grim determination. The air between them carried unspoken truths, that this was no simple pursuit of justice, that vengeance and law would collide within him, and that the outcome would shape not just his fate, but the fate of the city. Unknown to them, Hector's laughter still lingered in the corridors of the courthouse. Men who had heard it swore they could not sleep, the echo haunting them like a curse. That sound, dripping with mockery, fueled Elias's resolve even more. The city might cower, but he would not. He would turn fear into fire, silence into strength. He whispered to himself the words that would anchor him through the storm to come, a promise not just to his father but to every witness who had believed justice had died in that courtroom. If laughter spilled blood, then silence would return with fire. Elias's eyes burned as he scrolled through another file, the dim glow of the desk lamp casting sharp shadows across the stacks of documents around him. His small apartment had transformed into a war room, its walls lined with maps, photographs, and hastily scribbled notes connected by red string. Each page told the story of Hector Varela's empire, shipments that slipped past borders, officials whose pockets bulged with bribes, and men whose loyalty was written in blood. Elias leaned forward, his hands trembling from exhaustion but his mind sharper than ever. Sleep had become a luxury he could no longer afford. Every detail mattered, every whisper carried weight. Somewhere in this labyrinth of paper and ink, he believed, was the key to bringing Hector down. Agent Dorian Creed entered quietly, his trench coat still damp from the night rain. He stood at the threshold watching the young man bent over the desk. "You're wearing yourself out," he said firmly, his voice carrying the edge of authority earned from decades of service. "Revenge doesn't sharpen the mind, Elias. It clouds it." Elias didn't look up. His jaw tightened, his pen scribbling another connection between Hector's mountain compound and a list of suppliers. "I'm not here for revenge," he muttered, though the bitterness in his tone betrayed him. His fingers paused on the name of a lieutenant he had traced to the compound. "I'm here because the law demands justice." Dorian stepped closer, resting one hand on the cluttered desk. His eyes narrowed, scanning the web of information Elias had gathered. "Justice is what we fight for," he said, lowering his voice. "But obsession is what destroys men like us. I've seen it before." He placed a finger on one of the maps, circling the area where the compound hid between two ridges. "This isn't a street brawl. That fortress is guarded by men who owe their lives to Hector. If you let your anger lead, they'll tear you apart before you ever get through the gates." Elias finally met his gaze. His eyes were bloodshot, but inside them blazed a steady fire. "Then we don't go through the gates," he said quietly. "We go through the cracks he doesn't think exist." The words hung heavy in the room, and for a moment Dorian studied the younger man, trying to measure the line between determination and recklessness. At last, he sighed. "Very well. You'll be part of the task force. But hear me, Elias. You follow orders. You think with your head, not with the weight of your father's blood." Elias nodded, though in his heart he knew his path stretched further than Dorian's rules could contain. The following nights were filled with endless preparation. Elias sat among seasoned agents as they dissected the compound's layout, reviewing satellite images and intercepted calls. Each agent spoke with the discipline of professionals, but Elias's silence carried something else, something darker. He memorized every entry point, every guard rotation, every supply truck that entered the compound. When others saw a mission, Elias saw a reckoning. One evening, as the task force wrapped up a briefing, Elias overheard an operative mention Hector's private celebration. The cartel boss had thrown a lavish party inside his fortress, declaring it the day law died, mocking Judge Merrick's last words in the courtroom. Elias's fists clenched under the table. He could almost hear his father's voice in that final moment, warning Hector that no man was above the law. To have those words twisted into a drunken toast by the man who slit his throat was more than Elias could endure. Later, in the dim silence of the strategy room, Dorian found Elias alone again, staring at a photograph of the compound's main hall. "What is it you really want, Elias?" Dorian asked quietly. His tone was not sharp this time, but weary, as if speaking to a son rather than a recruit. Elias turned the photo over slowly, his knuckles white. "I want his laughter gone," he said. His voice was low, steady, and filled with a chilling clarity. "Not just caged, not just silenced by walls. I want it cut short, by fear, by justice, by whatever it takes." The older man's expression hardened. He recognized the path Elias was carving for himself, one that strayed dangerously close to vengeance. Yet he said nothing. The silence between them was both warning and reluctant acceptance. When the final plan was set, the agents spoke of evidence and lawful arrest. They spoke of dismantling Hector's empire piece by piece until nothing remained. But Elias carried a different script within his chest, one written in grief and sharpened by rage. To him, justice no longer meant only prison. It meant standing over Hector in the moment his arrogance crumbled, in the instant his laughter died on his lips. The room seemed colder as Elias packed his files, the echo of his father's final words heavy in his ears. His resolve was no longer a flicker. It was a blade waiting to strike. He whispered into the still air, as if swearing to the shadows themselves, "One way or another, I will cut that laughter short." Gunfire erupted as the compound gates blew open, the thunder of the explosion echoing across the valley and sending a flock of crows screaming into the night sky. The forest trembled with the blast, branches swaying as the black vans skidded to a halt. Masked men in tactical gear rushed forward, their boots crunching against gravel, rifles raised toward the looming fortress. Muzzle flashes lit the darkness like jagged lightning, tearing through the night air with merciless rhythm. From the guard towers, Hector's men returned fire with brutal precision, their silhouettes cutting harsh shapes against the glow of floodlights. Bullets cracked into stone walls and ricocheted across the courtyard, showering sparks into the air. The acrid stench of smoke and gunpowder thickened, stinging every breath. Elias Merrick pressed himself against the shattered remains of the gate, the steel vest biting into his ribs as he tried to steady his breathing. His fingers clenched around the cold grip of a borrowed pistol, slick with sweat despite the freezing mountain air. His chest rose and fell sharply, but it was not fear that made him tremble. It was the burning anticipation, the furious need to see Hector Varela fall. He heard Dorian's voice cutting through the radio chatter, sharp and commanding, "Team Alpha, breach left flank. Beta, hold the courtyard." The orders came crisp, but Elias hardly listened. His eyes were fixed on the mansion above, its stone walls gleaming under the floodlights like the skin of some untouchable beast. The first wave pushed forward, covering fire, shredding the night. Elias sprinted with them, boots splashing through puddles of rain that still lingered from the afternoon storm. Sparks burst around him as bullets chipped away at the ground. A man beside him fell with a cry, his helmet cracking against the pavement, blood seeping into the dirt. Elias ducked behind a low wall, pressing his back against it and forcing himself not to look at the fallen soldier. His heart thundered, but a strange calm clung to his thoughts. He remembered the spray of red in the courtroom, his father's final breath, and the laughter that had filled the silence. That sound was louder in his mind than the gunfire now. Then he saw him. On the balcony, high above the courtyard, Hector Varela stood like a king surveying his arena. A glass of wine glinted in his hand, crimson liquid swirling lazily as if the chaos below were nothing but a performance staged for his amusement. His black suit caught the glow of the lights, his silver ring flashing as he raised the glass in mock salute. And then, unmistakably, came the sound, his laughter. It rolled across the courtyard, deep and mocking, cutting through the gunfire with a chilling clarity that froze Elias's breath in his chest. The laughter was not loud by volume, but it was deafening by memory. Elias's jaw tightened, teeth grinding. He shoved off the wall, his decision made in an instant. "I see him," he shouted, though his voice was nearly drowned by the storm of bullets. Dorian's sharp reply cracked in his earpiece, "Stay in cover, Merrick. Do not advance. That's an order." But Elias's legs were already moving, muscles driving him forward with reckless fury. He darted from cover to cover, ignoring the screams of warning around him. Each step felt like a hammer driving him toward the inevitable. His pistol shook in his hand, but his eyes never left the balcony where Hector stood, wine in hand, laughter rising. The stairs loomed ahead, a steep climb up the side of the mansion, flanked by gunmen pouring lead into the courtyard. Elias raised his pistol, firing wildly, the recoil snapping his arm back. One guard crumpled, another ducked, and Elias charged into the open, adrenaline burning hotter than fear. Bullets cracked past his ears, one grazing his shoulder and sending a sting of fire down his arm. He stumbled but kept climbing, his boots pounding the stone steps. Halfway up, the noise of battle faded in his mind, drowned beneath Hector's mocking grin above him. Elias's breath tore at his lungs, his vision tunneling, but he pressed forward. The balcony was so close now, the silhouette of Hector leaning lazily against the railing, his free hand resting casually on the blade tucked beneath his jacket. Their eyes locked, and Hector's smirk widened. "You think you're ready, boy?" Hector's voice cut through the chaos, low and venomous. "You think you can climb to me?" He lifted his glass, sipping with theatrical slowness as Elias hauled himself upward. The sound of laughter spilled again, echoing down the stone. Elias gritted his teeth, ignoring the pain that surged through his ribs with every breath. His father's lifeless eyes haunted him. The image burned so deep that nothing else mattered. His pistol wavered, then steadied as he reached the final stretch of stairs. Just a few more steps, and he would face the man who had taken everything. But fate intervened. A sharp click echoed beneath his boots. faint yet unmistakable. Before Elias could react, the stone steps groaned and gave way. The world tilted beneath him, the balcony receding as the stairs collapsed in a violent shatter of stone and iron. He plummeted into the courtyard, his body slamming against the ground with bone-rattling force. Pain exploded in his side, the breath ripped from his lungs as dust and rubble rained down around him. His pistol skidded across the dirt, useless and out of reach. Above him, Hector's laughter roared louder than ever. The cartel boss leaned over the railing, wineglass still in hand, his teeth flashing white against the night. "Like father, like son," he shouted, his voice dripping with venom. "Always bleeding, never winning." The raid ended in bitter failure. Smoke still clung to Elias's lungs as he was rushed out of the compound, his arm bent at a wrong angle and his ribs aching with every shallow breath. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing closer, though they sounded like a cruel mockery of rescue. He remembered the splintering of the staircase beneath him, the sight of Hector standing above like a king untouched by chaos, wineglass raised and laughter booming as if bullets were merely applause. Now, lying on the stiff hospital bed hours later, Elias felt each echo of that laughter pound against his skull harder than his fractured bones. Dorian Creed stood over him, his face shadowed beneath the cold fluorescent light. His voice was hard, almost breaking under the weight of disappointment. "You nearly cost every man in that raid his life," he said, leaning forward, his jaw tense. His eyes, sharp as steel, studied Elias like a soldier studies a broken weapon. "Recklessness doesn't win wars, Elias. It ends them." Elias turned his head, wincing at the stab of pain in his ribs, but his gaze was steady. "I saw him," he replied, voice hoarse yet defiant. "I had him in my sight." For once, he wasn't untouchable. His fingers tightened into a fist on the bedsheet, bloodied knuckles trembling. "I couldn't just stand by while he mocked us again." Dorian's silence stretched, heavy and suffocating. The steady beep of the monitor filled the space between them. Then, with a deep breath, the agent said, "Your anger blinds you. If you can't control it, Hector will use it against you again. He thrives on men like you, driven, desperate, willing to bleed just to silence his laugh." But Elias did not flinch. Pain twisted through his body, but the fire in his chest burned hotter than his injuries. He knew Dorian was right, yet the thought of retreating, of letting Hector continue his reign of terror unchecked, felt worse than death. That night, as the hospital ward settled into uneasy quiet, Elias stared at the ceiling and let the plan form in his mind. If brute force could not defeat Hector, then he would strike with something more dangerous: patience. Days later, with his arm in a sling and his ribs bound tight beneath his shirt, Elias pored over files in the task force's dimly lit office. Papers littered the desk, each one a fragment of Hector's empire. Bribes, shipments, coded communications. His eyes tracked every line, every signature, every date, until one truth emerged. Hector, for all his cunning, was bound by his arrogance. He never stayed away from the city for long. Every few weeks he returned like a monarch visiting his throne, bribing officials, striking deals in the shadows, and reminding the law of its fragility. Elias leaned back in his chair, exhaustion etched deep into his features. He whispered aloud, as if speaking to the ghost of his father. "He thinks the city bends to him. That's where we break him." When Dorian entered, Elias laid out his findings. "We forge documents," he explained, his voice steadier now, the fire in his eyes tempered by cold calculation. "False ledgers, false communications, evidence that one of his own lieutenants has betrayed him. Hector won't ignore it. He'll come back to confront the traitor himself. He won't send others. He'll want to see their fear, hear their excuses. That's when we take him." Dorian crossed his arms, pacing the length of the room. His boots echoed against the tile, each step carrying the weight of hesitation. "It's dangerous," he said finally. "If he suspects a trap, he'll vanish into the shadows again. And this time, we may not find him." Elias's jaw tightened. "Then we make sure he doesn't suspect. We know his pride, it's his weakness. He won't resist the chance to prove himself superior, not when he thinks betrayal lurks in his own ranks." The older agent studied Elias for a long moment, reading both the resolve and the fury that burned inside him. At last, Dorian gave a slow nod. "All right, but hear me, Elias. This can't be about revenge. If you let your anger lead, you'll destroy the very justice you claim to defend." Elias did not answer right away. He stood, steady despite the pain in his side, and moved to the window overlooking the city. Lights glittered in the distance, each one a reminder of the people living in fear, while Hector laughed freely. His reflection in the glass looked pale and worn, but his eyes glowed with a dangerous calm. "Justice," he said softly, almost to himself. "That's what I'll call it." But in the private corners of his heart, another word lingered. Vengeance. He imagined Hector standing once more inside a courtroom, the very place he had desecrated with blood and mockery. Elias pictured the fear twisting Hector's grin, the silence swallowing his laugh, the bench rising against him instead of bowing. He would not say it aloud, not even to Dorian, but his true plan was already sealed. As the office lights flickered in the midnight hour, Elias's shadow stretched long across the wall, merging with the city's darkness beyond. In that shadow, the future was written, not with law alone, but with fire, patience, and resolve. And though the path ahead promised danger, Elias welcomed it with clenched fists and unyielding eyes. If he defiled the bench with blood, then the bench will deliver him back his fate. He thought silencing a judge in front of the world would prove his power, but justice doesn't stay silent. If you believe every act of cruelty must be answered, hit subscribe. Justice starts here. The warehouse doors slammed open with a metallic crash as Hector Varela stormed inside, the sound echoing like thunder in the cavernous space. The air smelled of oil and rust, the floor stained with years of forgotten industry. His boots struck the concrete with sharp finality, and in his hand glinted the cold steel of a blade, its surface catching the weak light that filtered through the high, cracked windows. Two of his men followed close behind, their eyes scanning the shadows, weapons held tight. But Hector's gaze was fixed forward, his jaw clenched and his laughter already rising in anticipation. "Traitors," he spat, his voice reverberating against the walls, "I will carve the truth from your tongues." From the darkness above the rafters, Elias Merrick held his breath. The pistol in his grip felt heavier than ever before, the weight of both metal and memory pressing down on him. His heartbeat pounded in his ears, loud enough he feared Hector could hear it. Below, the cartel boss's steps grew louder, closer, each one feeding the fire of rage that had been burning inside Elias since the day his father fell in court. The warehouse, stripped of machines but filled with staged evidence, looked convincing. Papers scattered on a desk, empty crates labeled with falsified government seals, and folders stuffed with false agreements meant to suggest betrayal. It was bait, and Hector had lunged at it without hesitation. Hector's laughter broke out suddenly, jagged and cruel. "So, this is what betrayal looks like," he sneered, slamming his blade into the wooden table and scattering the fake documents across the floor. His men muttered nervously, their eyes darting. One leaned toward him, whispering something about the strangeness of the scene, but Hector silenced him with a glare sharp enough to cut. His arrogance radiated through the room, a man who had defied the law once and believed he could do so again. He raised the blade from the table and pointed it toward the shadows. "Come out, whoever you are," he taunted. "You cannot hide from me." And then, with a sudden blinding brilliance, the lights blazed on. Floodlamps mounted on the beams roared to life, banishing the shadows and illuminating the scene in harsh white glare. Dozens of federal agents emerged from cover, weapons aimed, their shouts filling the air. "Drop your weapon!" On the ground now. The command repeated in unison, the sound of authority ringing against the steel walls. For the first time, Hector hesitated, but only for a heartbeat. His laughter burst out again, deep and defiant, echoing across the warehouse as if he had orchestrated the moment himself. He raised his blade, not in surrender, but as if daring the entire task force to fire. Gunfire erupted as his men tried to resist, the thunder of bullets crashing into crates and walls. Splinters flew, dust rose, and the scene dissolved into chaos. Elias moved. He stepped from his hiding place, every muscle in his body taut, his pistol raised. His eyes locked instantly with Hector's, and in that shared gaze burned the memory of crimson spraying across a courtroom, the gavel slipping from his father's hand, the laughter that had followed. Time slowed, the gunfire around him fading into a distant hum. All Elias saw was Hector, alive, grinning, mocking. Hector's eyes lit up with recognition. He laughed louder, the sound piercing, cruel, as if the bullets around him were no more than applause. "You!" he shouted over the chaos, pointing his blade with theatrical flourish. "The son of the man I silenced. Come, boy, show me you are more than his shadow." Elias's breath shook, but his hands did not. He raised his pistol, arms steady, the muzzle aimed squarely at Hector's chest. His pulse raced, each beat pounding against the weight of his decision. He remembered his father's stern words about justice, about law standing above vengeance. Yet the sight of Hector's sneer, the echo of his laugh, tore at his resolve like barbed wire. Every fiber of his body screamed for release, for the chance to end it all with a single squeeze of the trigger. The battle raged around them, agents firing, cartel gunmen falling, but in that moment Elias felt as though the entire world had narrowed to just two men, the judge's son and the cartel lord. His finger hovered against the trigger, the line between justice and vengeance thinning to almost nothing. Hector tilted his head back, his laughter swelling, taunting. His voice carried above the cacophony, aimed like a blade straight into Elias's heart. "Do it," he mocked, his grin wide, his eyes alight with savage delight. "And prove you're no different from me." The standoff lasted seconds, but it felt eternal. Elias's arm trembled as his finger curled tighter against the trigger, the weight of his pistol anchoring him in a decision that could change everything. Across the room, Hector Varela stood with the blade glinting in the harsh warehouse light, his grin wide, his eyes daring, his body angled forward like a predator about to pounce. The noise of gunfire and shouts around them seemed to fade for Elias, as though the world had narrowed to a single choice: pull the trigger and silence the man who had stolen his father's life, or hesitate and risk everything. His breath came shallow, each heartbeat pounding like a drum inside his skull. He could almost smell the faint tang of blood and gunpowder mixing with the rust of the warehouse air. For one suspended moment, time did not move. Then, with a sudden surge, Dorian Creed lunged. The federal agent's shoulder slammed into Hector with brutal precision, knocking the cartel boss backward. The blade clattered across the concrete floor, spinning until it came to rest near a toppled chair. Dorian wrestled Hector down, his voice gritted with effort. "Not today, Varela." The sound of shackles snapping shut on Hector's wrists broke the tension like a lightning strike. The task force erupted with shouts of triumph, some pounding the air in victory, others pulling back to cover exits. The room was alive with movement, but for Elias it was strangely hollow. His pistol still hovered in his grip, his chest heaving, his eyes locked on the man who had just been restrained. Hector's face was smeared with sweat and dirt, yet his expression never faltered. Even with chains binding him, his mouth curled upward in a smile that carried no fear. His eyes found Elias, dark and gleaming with mockery. Elias lowered his weapon slowly, his hand stiff, but inside his chest, rage clawed. This had been his moment, his one chance to repay blood with blood, and it had slipped away. He felt cheated, like a man watching justice stolen at the edge of his grasp. Around him, agents celebrated, but their voices blurred into meaningless noise. To Elias, it was not victory. It was silence filled with the echo of his father's last breath. As the task force moved Hector toward the armored transport vehicle waiting outside, Elias followed in heavy steps, his jaw clenched tight enough to ache. The warehouse smelled of cordite and smoke, and the faint crackle of fire from a shattered generator filled the air. Men groaned on the ground, Hector's guards subdued, some bleeding, others unconscious. But Hector himself walked upright, even in shackles, his posture straight, his grin unbroken. It was as if the man had orchestrated even his capture, turning the moment into another twisted performance. Inside the vehicle, dim red lights cast long shadows. Elias sat across from Hector, the space tight, the atmosphere suffocating. The sound of the engine vibrated beneath them, punctuated by the muffled radio chatter of agents in escort vehicles. Hector leaned forward despite the restraints, his voice low but cutting through the hum. "Cages cannot silence me, boy," he whispered, his tone sharp and intimate, his lips curling around each word like venom. "I will laugh, even from the grave." The words struck Elias like a blow. His fist tightened on his knee until the knuckles blanched. He wanted to speak, to retort, but the silence that followed felt heavier than any words he could summon. Hector leaned back, eyes closing, as if savoring the unease he had planted. The sound of distant laughter, phantom or memory, echoed in Elias's mind. He turned his gaze to the reinforced windows, the city lights flickering past. They looked blurred, distorted, as though even the world outside was warped by Hector's presence. When they arrived at the maximum security facility, the night air was sharp and biting. Searchlights swept across the yard, and towers loomed with rifles poised. Every gate clanged shut with metallic certainty as Hector was escorted inside. Elias trailed behind the line of officers, his thoughts grinding. The prison's stone walls seemed strong, but doubt nagged at him. This was the same man who had turned a courtroom into a slaughterhouse. Bars and chains alone had never stopped him before. As Hector disappeared into the belly of the prison, Elias remained by the gate, watching until the last door slammed. He could feel the eyes of guards on him, some nodding in reassurance, others cautious. But Elias's focus never shifted. His heart was not eased by steel walls or locks. He knew this was not the end. It was the pause before another storm. That night, as Elias returned to his small apartment, exhaustion weighed on him, but rest never came. The image of Hector's smirk, the memory of his whisper, clung to him like smoke. He sat at his desk, his father's old fountain pen lying untouched beside files of the case. His reflection in the window looked worn, older than his years. He thought of his father's words, of dignity, of the law. Yet the shadow of Hector's laughter still lurked in every corner. Somewhere in the city, rumors already spread of cartel retaliation. Citizens whispered that Hector's men would try again, that the courthouse was cursed, that justice could never stand against such defiance. Elias pressed his palms against the desk, steadying himself. He would not let fear become truth. He would not let laughter be the last sound that defined this story. The city braced for chaos, fearing his cartel would strike again. Elias prepared, determined that this time the courtroom would not be Hector's theater. This time it would be his tomb. The laughter will end where it began, in the court. The courthouse shook with the metallic clang of gates locking into place as armored vehicles rumbled into position outside. The faint hum of generators powered the floodlights glaring over the marble steps, casting long shadows across the square where dozens of armed guards stood at attention. Inside, the heavy wooden doors creaked open, and the packed chamber fell into a suffocating silence. Hector Varela entered in chains, his wrists bound in steel, but his posture as upright and arrogant as if he were walking into a banquet hall. His grin sliced through the silence, a grin that reminded everyone of the blood once spilled in this very place. The chains clinked against the polished floor, but it was his mocking eyes, scanning every spectator, every guard, every camera, that made the air feel colder. Elias Merrick sat stiffly at the prosecution's table, his jaw clenched so tightly it hurt. He refused to flinch as Hector's gaze lingered on him, daring him to show fear. Elias's mind replayed his father's final moments, that gurgling breath and the crimson spray across the bench. The memory burned, but he forced it down. Today was not about rage. Today was about proving that justice could stand taller than cruelty. His fingers tapped the stack of files before him, each page filled with testimonies and evidence carefully gathered to seal Hector's fate. Still, Elias knew Hector's true weapon wasn't hidden blades or bribed guards. It was his laughter, the sound that had turned a court of law into a theater of humiliation. The trial began with formality, the judge reading charges while cameras broadcasted every word to millions watching across the nation. The walls themselves seemed alive, humming faintly with the secret recorders placed by federal operatives. No longer could Hector's performance be confined to this chamber. Every smirk, every word would echo beyond these walls. Yet Hector embraced the stage. He leaned back in his chair, chains rattling lightly as though they were jewelry instead of restraints. His grin widened when a witness began to speak about the cartel's brutality. "Tell them louder," Hector chuckled, his voice low but sharp enough for the microphone to catch. "They enjoy the stories." Gasps rippled through the spectators. The judge slammed his gavel, demanding silence, but Hector only laughed harder, his shoulders shaking with mockery. The sound crawled into every corner of the chamber, pressing against Elias's ears until he wanted to shout. He gripped his pen so hard it snapped, ink spilling across the notes in front of him. He glanced briefly at Agent Dorian Creed, seated a few rows back, who met his gaze with a subtle shake of the head. "Patience," the jester said. Patience would turn Hector's own arrogance into the rope that would hang him. The prosecution pressed forward. Photos of murders, ledgers of drug shipments, testimonies of terrified survivors, all placed before the court like bricks of a wall closing in on Hector. But every new piece of evidence seemed only to amuse him. He chuckled at photos of bodies, smirked as survivors wept through their words, and at one point leaned forward to the microphone whispering, "I gave them purpose." The chamber erupted in outrage until guards shoved him back into his seat. Still, the grin remained. Elias's chest tightened. He wanted to leap from his chair and silence Hector with his own hands, but he steadied himself. The world was watching, and that was the trap. The louder Hector mocked, the more damning his performance became. Hours stretched into a tense rhythm, evidence, testimony, interruptions. Hector's grin never faded. He turned each accusation into fuel for his theater, sneering at officers, mocking the prosecutor's questions, and winking at reporters seated in the gallery. But beneath the arrogance, Elias noticed something else. Hector's eyes flickered, just barely, when the judge reminded him that all proceedings were live, that every citizen was hearing his words in real time. That flicker, quick and fleeting, told Elias one thing. Hector had not expected the stage to extend this far. When a former lieutenant testified, voice trembling as he described Hector's executions, Hector erupted in laughter so loud it shook the chamber. "He lies because he breathes," Hector shouted, rising halfway from his chair before guards forced him down. The cameras caught every second, the wild eyes, the booming laugh, the gleam of defiance. Elias felt his pulse hammer in his temples, but this time he didn't see failure. He saw the trap snapping shut. The more Hector laughed, the more the world recoiled. The judge called for order again, his voice stern, but the sound barely touched Hector, who continued chuckling under his breath, a man who believed the court still belonged to him. Elias leaned forward, his voice steady but edged with fire. "Laugh all you want," he said across the room, words cutting through the hush, "because today the world is listening." Hector's grin faltered for the briefest second, a crack in his mask that only Elias noticed. The trial dragged into evening, tension mounting with every passing hour. Outside, armored vehicles stood firm as night fell, floodlights illuminating the courthouse like a fortress. Inside, the chamber's air was heavy with expectation, as though everyone awaited a storm. Hector continued to sneer, but the sneer now looked strained, pulled too tightly across his face. Elias sat straighter, refusing to let his father's death echo in silence. The trap was not only in evidence or law, it was in the very act of making Hector's laughter echo across the world as his own confession. As the judge adjourned for the day, Hector leaned back, still grinning, still smirking, but Elias saw what he had been waiting for, the faint twitch in Hector's jaw, the weight pressing against his arrogance. Elias closed his files carefully, stood, and walked from the table with measured steps. He didn't need to imagine the verdict yet. The court had already turned Hector's weapon against him. His laughter was no longer power, it was the sound of his undoing, and as Elias stepped into the corridor filled with guards and reporters, he whispered under his breath the truth that had guided his patience all along. This time, his laughter would condemn him louder than any gavel. The explosion rattled the courthouse walls with a thunderous roar. Windows quaked in their frames, dust fell from the high ceiling, and the chamber erupted in cries of confusion. Guards shouted orders, some sprinting toward the exits to secure the perimeter, while others instinctively moved to shield the jury and court officials. The acrid smell of smoke seeped in from outside, mingling with the heavy silence that followed the blast. But within the chamber, the true storm was only beginning. Hector Varela shifted in his seat, his chains clinking softly, his eyes gleaming with a predatory light. The cartel boss leaned forward, the faintest curl of amusement tugging at his lips. As the room faltered in its rhythm, he struck. From beneath the folds of his prison uniform, his hand emerged gripping a narrow blade, its metal glinting wickedly beneath the courtroom lights. The weapon, impossibly smuggled in despite endless security, cut through the air like a shadow long awaited. A gasp rippled across the chamber. In an instant, memories of Judge Merrick's final moments resurfaced in every mind present. The flash of steel, the crimson spray, the laughter that mocked the very notion of law. Not again, Elias Merrick thought, his pulse hammering in his ears. He had waited for this moment, dreaded it, prepared for it. Every nightmare, every sleepless night, every vow whispered to his father's portrait had led to this instant. And now Hector lunged, his laughter bursting out like a cruel song, echoing against marble and wood, piercing the hearts of all who heard it. Time seemed to slow. Elias rose from his chair, his hand slipping beneath the table where his pistol lay concealed. The courtroom lights gleamed off the barrel as his fingers wrapped around the grip. His breath steadied even as chaos threatened to crush him. Hector's eyes locked on him, wild and filled with that same mocking certainty, as if fate itself bent to his will. "Die like your father," Hector roared, his blade flashing downward as he lunged toward Elias. But Elias did not flinch. His voice, calm yet burning with years of pain, broke the silence. Not this time. The crack of the gunshot shattered the air. The sound was sharp, final, unyielding. The bullet tore through Hector's hand, splintering bone, ripping flesh, and sending the blade clattering across the polished floor. Blood sprayed in a violent arc, spattering Hector's face, staining his chains, marking the moment as one of irreversible change. Hector screamed, not with laughter, but with raw, guttural rage. The sound was unrecognizable, stripped of arrogance and spectacle. He staggered, clutching the mangled ruin of his hand, his body trembling not from power but from pain. Officers surged forward like a wave, crashing down on him, dragging him to the ground with brutal efficiency. Shackles rattled, boots slammed, fists pinned him against the wood, and his defiance was drowned beneath the sheer weight of restraint. The chamber froze in collective awe. For once, Hector's laughter was absent. The silence that followed was heavier than the explosion outside, heavier than the chaos of the cartel's assault. Jurors clung to one another, wide-eyed and trembling. Reporters, their hands shaking, fumbled with pens and cameras, capturing the instant they knew would be written into history. Guards pressed tighter around Elias, their voices urgent, but he hardly heard them. His pistol lowered, smoke curling faintly from the barrel, Elias's heart thundered against his ribs. He had acted without hesitation, yet he felt no triumph, only a strange emptiness. This was not revenge in its rawest form, not the bloody end his rage had long fantasized about. This was something else. This was control. This was discipline. It was the refusal to let Hector define the story once more. Across the chamber floor, Hector writhed beneath the grip of the guards, his breath ragged, his pride shattered. His eyes, once filled with mocking glee, burned now with something different, hatred, fury, the sting of defeat. Yet the silence around him screamed louder than any words he could muster. He had always been the one to command fear, to bend law into theater, to turn justice into spectacle. Now he was the spectacle, broken, silenced, and exposed before all. Elias stood tall, his pistol still in hand, his face pale but resolute. He met Hector's gaze one final time, searching for the echoes of that laughter that had haunted his life. But none came. For the first time since his father's murder, Hector had been robbed of his cruelest weapon, his voice. The court remained hushed, breathless, unwilling to break the fragile silence that had settled. Men who had braced themselves for another tragedy now watched as history turned. Some whispered prayers of gratitude, others simply stared in disbelief. Elias knew this was not the end. Trials and sentences still lay ahead, but in this moment, the cycle had been broken. The echoes of Hector's mockery had finally been drowned, not by vengeance, but by resolve. And as Elias slowly placed his weapon back on the table, the finality of the moment settled into the walls, etched into memory. The chamber, the city, the nation, none would forget the instant Hector's reign of terror fractured. The silence held, unbroken, until Elias whispered the words that carried the weight of both his father's death and his own rebirth as a man of justice. The laughter ended in a spray of red. The trial resumed with Hector alive but broken. His bandaged hand rested awkwardly on the defense table, swollen and bloodied, a grim reminder of the shot that had shattered his grip on control. His once booming laughter had shriveled into rasping murmurs, and though he still tried to sneer, the sharpness of his defiance was gone. The courtroom, fortified and silent, carried an air of both relief and unease. Everyone present understood that this was no ordinary proceeding. It was the slow dismantling of a man who had mocked justice and murdered its symbol in open daylight. Elias sat at the prosecution's table, his posture rigid, his jaw tense. He watched Hector's every move, every flicker of expression, with the vigilance of a hawk. The image of his father's final breath still haunted him, yet he no longer trembled with rage. Instead, he felt the weight of responsibility pressing heavily on his chest. This was no longer about vengeance, it was about proving to the city, to the nation, and to himself that law was stronger than fear. The chamber's thick wooden walls seemed to hold the echoes of past violence, and yet this time there was a new atmosphere, determination rather than dread. Witnesses were called one by one. Former cartel members who had turned against Hector under protective custody spoke in low voices, their eyes darting nervously toward him. Each testimony added another stone to the wall of evidence being built against the once untouchable kingpin. A federal officer stepped forward, recounting raids that had exposed Hector's hidden caches of weapons and cash. Another detailed the trail of corruption that tied Hector to officials, judges, and officers across Valor City. Hector shifted uneasily, his once commanding presence shrinking. His attempts to interrupt or laugh were half-hearted, weak bursts of sound that faded under the judge's firm gavel. The spectators noticed the change too. Where once his laughter had silenced the room in terror, now it was his silence that commanded attention, a silence born not of power, but of defeat. Elias rose for closing arguments. His black suit clung to his frame, his hands steady as he placed them on the wooden podium. He let the silence linger before speaking, allowing every ear to tune to his voice. "This case is not about vengeance," Elias said, his tone clear and unwavering. His eyes swept across the jury, then shifted briefly to the empty bench where his father once sat. "It is about the law. It is about dignity. It is about proving that no man, no matter his power, no matter his cruelty, can mock justice and escape its reach." As he spoke, the chamber seemed to draw tighter around him. Jurors leaned forward, reporters scribbled frantically. Even the guards along the walls stood straighter, as if reminded of their purpose. Elias's words were more than argument. They were a pledge to restore the integrity that Hector had torn apart with a single slash of his blade. He paused, locking eyes with Hector, who sat slumped in his chair. "The accused thought laughter could silence justice," Elias continued, his voice firm. "But justice does not bow. It does not break. Today, it stands louder than his cruelty." The words cut through the air, heavy with meaning. Hector tried to smirk, his lips curling faintly, but the effort looked pitiful. The courtroom seemed to hold its breath as Elias concluded, "This is not about revenge. It is about ensuring that the bench he defiled with blood is remembered not for its fall, but for its rise." When Elias returned to his seat, a hush fell across the chamber. The jury was dismissed to deliberate, though everyone sensed the decision had already been made. Hours that felt like minutes passed before they returned, faces set in grim certainty. The foreman stood, voice steady, and declared the verdict: guilty on all counts. The chamber erupted, not in chaos, but in relief. Applause mixed with quiet tears, reporters rushed to capture the moment, and guards closed in around Hector. He flinched as the sentence was delivered: life imprisonment, without parole, in the solitary wing of the nation's most fortified prison. His empire, once sprawling and terrifying, had been dismantled piece by piece until nothing remained but a man stripped of his illusions. Hector was dragged away, his head bowed, his laughter gone. The sound of shackles scraping against the floor echoed like the final punctuation of a grim chapter. Elias did not join the cheering crowd. Instead, he remained seated, his gaze fixed on the bench where his father should have been. He imagined Roland Merrick standing tall, nodding in approval, proud that his son had carried the weight of law with honor. And yet, even in that moment of victory, Elias felt a lingering shadow. Justice had been won, but scars, he knew, did not fade with verdicts. The echoes of Hector's laughter still haunted him, a ghost that would not easily be silenced. As the courtroom emptied, Elias whispered quietly to himself, more to the portrait in his mind than to the living around him. Justice won, but scars do not vanish with verdicts. Elias stood at the center of the rebuilt courthouse, the polished marble beneath his shoes gleaming under the late afternoon light that filtered through tall windows. The air inside was heavy, though not with fear as it had once been, but with a solemn kind of reverence. Above the judge's bench his father's portrait hung, framed in dark oak, the stern yet kind eyes of Roland Merrick gazing down as though watching over the hall once more. Elias's breath caught as he stared at it. The memory of that terrible day surged back uninvited, the blade flashing, the spray of red, the sound of mocking laughter that had shaken the very walls. Yet here, in this moment, the silence felt powerful. This silence was not born of fear. It was the silence of victory, of justice restored, though scarred. He walked slowly toward the bench, his hand brushing against the smooth wooden railing. Around him, the courthouse was alive again. Clerks carried stacks of documents, young prosecutors in suits whispered nervously to one another, and guards patrolled with measured steps. Each sound echoed faintly, building a rhythm that reminded Elias of order, of a system trying to heal. But beneath it all, he felt the weight of responsibility pressing on his shoulders. Justice had been reclaimed, yes, but what good was victory if it ended with him? His father's death, the trials, the battles, these had to mean more than a single verdict. That thought was the seed of his decision. Elias had already founded the Merrick Initiative, a program designed to train young prosecutors not just in the technicalities of law, but in the resilience needed to face intimidation, corruption, and violence. He recalled the first gathering in a dim lecture hall where nervous men barely out of law school had sat hunched, unsure if they were ready. Elias had stood before them and said, "The law is not only written in books, it is written in the courage of those who defend it." His voice had trembled at first, but then steadied as he saw the firelight in their eyes. In them he saw himself, before blood stained his suit, before vengeance gnawed at his soul. That evening, as he lingered in the courthouse, Agent Dorian Creed arrived. The older man's presence was as unshakable as ever, his trench coat heavy with rain, his eyes sharp but softened by familiarity. He walked with quiet authority toward Elias, glancing once at Roland Merrick's portrait before turning to the son. "You've done something your father would have been proud of," Dorian said, his voice low but firm. Elias turned to face him, noting the faint lines of exhaustion on the agent's face, the wear of decades chasing men like Hector Varela. "I nearly lost myself," Elias admitted. His hand flexed unconsciously, remembering the weight of the pistol, the moment he almost let vengeance dictate his fate. "I thought killing him would end the laughter. But it didn't. It never would have." Dorian's gaze narrowed, not in judgment but in reflection. He folded his arms, his stance steady. "Revenge always promises closure, but delivers emptiness. You chose discipline instead. That choice is what saved you." His words struck deep, the kind that cut through pride and left only truth. Elias looked back at his father's portrait and felt a quiet ache. Later that night, when the courthouse emptied and the city outside hummed with the muted sounds of traffic and distant sirens, Elias remained. Alone in the vast chamber, shadows stretched long across the polished floor. He sat at one of the benches, the same kind where terrified citizens once ducked for cover as chaos reigned. The silence pressed against his ears, but in that silence he still heard faint echoes, Hector's mocking laugh, cruel and endless. It was not real, he knew, just memory. Still, it haunted him. His fists clenched, his jaw tightened, and for a moment he felt the old fire threaten to consume him again. He rose, pacing slowly toward the bench where his father had once sat in judgment. Each step echoed sharply as though the hall itself demanded his resolve. Standing before the portrait, Elias drew in a steadying breath. He placed his hand against the polished frame, feeling the cool wood beneath his palm. The echoes faded. The laughter dimmed. All that remained was the silent approval of a father who had believed in law above all else. Elias's voice was low, steady, almost a whisper, but it carried through the chamber with surprising strength. The laughter died, but justice will always speak louder. Moments later, his laughter turned to screams. The same courtroom echoed with the sound of his downfall. If you stand for protecting the innocent and demanding accountability, subscribe now. Together, we rise. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It highlights themes of corruption, intimidation, and the downfall of those who misuse power through violence. Its purpose is to raise awareness, provoke reflection, and inspire accountability, justice, and resilience against oppression.